Hello everybody and welcome to my video. Today I'm going to be talking about a comparison between Octane versus Arnold versus the standard physical renderer inside of Cinema 4D that most likely you already have. Now I just want to point out very quickly that this comparison is of the demo versions of Octane and Arnold. I don't actually own them, but from what I hear they perform almost exactly the same, as I'd imagine that they would not have actual differences in the performance versus the full one, because that could reduce sales if their demos performed less as well as the actual full version. But getting into this here, basically, to make this test be as precise as possible, I'm using a demo version of another plugin called Ludwig Trees. I believe it's pronounced Ludwig. And once you install it and download it, you can click right up here and click the plant browser. And the reason I like these guys, for one, is their plugin is awesome. This is not an advertisement, but they give you for free, their demo version comes with 4 different plant species, and each species has 3 variations, and each variation has 3 different ages, and then each age has 3 different seasons. You can imagine the combinations we're getting right here. So you have winter, fall, and spring. So very cool, very awesome trees that they have here. But the reason I chose them for the test is every single tree comes with materials that you can load in directly compatible with these 3 renderers. So we have the standard Cinema 4D, then we have Arnold, and we have Octane. So this is going to make the textures look as close as possible, because if we'd use the same textures that we made in Octane and try and make them work for Arnold, they just wouldn't happen. Same thing for physical. So I felt that the fairest comparison was using these default textures for each tree and render out a 30-frame animation to compare overall speed and clarity of these renders here. But also to keep in mind, I also have edited the render settings a little bit to try and keep it a little bit more even, especially for Octane versus Cinema 4D. So what I did for Cinema, I'm going to start with our physical renderer. What I did is I just left it default. I went to physical, set it to sampler as fixed with a sampling quality of medium. That's all I did. Very simple. Now for Octane, on the other hand, we're going to go up here to Octane, live viewer window, and we're going to open up our settings. I did a little bit more. I followed a tutorial that a guy named Chad put out on Grayscale Gorilla for his favorite render settings, which is basically direct lighting mode, GI diffuse for the GI mode, and max samples of 128. So to be fair, I'm giving Octane a little bit easier time with the GI diffuse opposed to Cinema. But to also be fair, Cinema is not going to be calculating any global illumination or subsurface scattering, as that is not calculated in their thing at all. So if anything, Cinema 4D is getting a little bit of advantage here, but we're going to see. Now also, before I forget, let's look at some specs, because that's important. I'm going to go to my Twitch page here where I have all this written out just to make it easier. My GPU, this is what Octane is going to be running off of. I have a EVGA GTX 970 with 4 gigs of VRAM. Pretty decent card, I say. Not lower end. It's definitely towards the higher ends, but still consumer. And absolutely not the best there is out there. There's way better cards in this, especially since the new 1000 series came out, with the 1080 at this point being the dominant card till the 1080 Ti comes out. Next, we move on to our CPU, which is my Intel 4790K. Again, definitely not a base card, and it's definitely a higher up there CPU, I mean. But again, not the best one out there by any means. This is a 4-core quad that runs at 4 gigahertz. I do not have it overclocked whatsoever. It's just standard base clock at 4 gigahertz. And it comes by default running at 4.3 gigahertz as it overclocks itself a little bit, which is very nice. So again, this is not a prosumer card by any means. It is only a quad core. We're not in like a 6, 8, or even a 10 core or 12 core by any means. So I feel like this GPU versus CPU is a pretty decent fair comparison. To be fair though, my CPU is at this point the most powerful, or should I say fastest consumer card that you can buy, as anything above 4 core, in my opinion, is leaving the consumer market and heading more to professional and rendering, though I'm starting to see that more. But this is possibly, I have a higher end CPU versus GPU on this one, so the GPU may be a little bit more low end compared to the CPU, but again, it's very close, relative, but here's the specs. CPU cooler, H100i, motherboard is the Asus Maximum VII Hero, RAM, 16 gigs of the Corsair Vengeance, DDR3 at 2133 Hz. I have an SSD, which is 840 Series Pro at 256 gigs. Standard regular hard drive, doesn't really matter. It's a Digital Black Series 3 terabyte. My PSU is an 850 watt, plenty of power case. Headset, what you're hearing me talk through right now, is the BPHS-1 from Audio-Technica. Very nice. And my chair, which has literally nothing to do with this whatsoever. So, without further ado, let's get down to these comparisons and actually see how this all turned out. Now, to speed things along, I actually rendered this out ahead of time, but I'll show you the process before I actually show you the results so you kind of understand how I got what I did. Say I rendered out this animation here with Arnold. Now, you're not seeing the textures load in because I'm set to Arnold right now, and they're not going to show up until I render them in the viewport to make it a little easier. So you'll see this animation here. It's not very clean or nice at all. It's very messy, but the point is just getting different angles and seeing speed. So now that we have all that done there, we don't need Octane to be opened up. Basically what I would do, say we rendered this out, what I would do is I would delete this tree, and there's cleaner ways of doing this, but I would just remove all those textures. I'd keep my camera. I'd open my Ludwig browser, and I'd change this to, say, Octane, and I'd redrag out a new tree, which would be the exact same spot, because the coordinates are locked into the center of the world, perfectly zeroed out. And then I would just keep this light, and what I would do is under my, say we're going to be doing Octane, Octane, we're going to open up our live viewer. And under Objects, I would create an Octane area light, and I would just parent that underneath this light to make sure it's in the exact same position. And we'd lock that out. I'd pause this render, and then we would have this set up. So now we can take this light out of here, and we can delete that one. So now we have this exact same scene, and what I can basically do is change my renderer to Octane Render, and then have it render this scene out. Now, how does this look in Octane? Well, I could pull this out under plugins. If I can, actually, I'm just going to go to Octane Live Viewer, and we can pop this thing on, and it's going to load it in, and we can take a look at the Octane render. Now, thing to note with Octane, there you go. There's this tree. You're going to probably wonder, why does this tree look like this very strange shell? Well, it's very smart with Ludwig, as they have for the viewport render these very low poly, low demanding versions of the tree, and the actual resolution you can see clearly is gorgeous. So very interesting how that works. So we're just going to pause this, and now let's move on to the actual results. I did the same process for every version of the renderer, so it's very fair to compare. So let's start at the top with Octane. The standard renderer. Let's just blow this up to full screen, and before I forget, let's also take a look at, sorry for jumping around here. I rendered this out at a 16:9 aspect ratio at 800 by 450 resolution, just to keep it small so I could have lower render times total, as well as being in with the resolution limit that the demo versions of Octane and Arnold have. So basically we have these right here. So here's with the standard renderer. Looks pretty good, not too bad. Also, I made sure to put area shadows on for the light that I use, and I did not use a point light. I used an area light in Cinema 4D to keep it more relative to this proper comparison. So it was all in that top left corner. We can scrub through the animation. It's nothing fancy, nothing pretty. In fact, let's make this full screen, and we can scrub through, and we'll blow that up. There we go. We can scrub this through, and we can see that there we go. That's it. And this took a total render time of 5 minutes and 11 seconds for this 30-frame animation right here. Next, let's move on to Octane. So you can see right off the bat, it took 4 minutes and 8 seconds, so over a minute faster total, which is pretty nice. And on top of that, we have global illumination. So you'll notice in comparison that we can compare here to here, and you'll notice these lines. That's because of demo version, but don't worry, that doesn't affect render quality or the speed whatsoever. And if we look at our standard version, you'll see that the shadows are much darker. They actually go pure black where the light doesn't reach because it's not bouncing, because there's no global illumination. And on Octane, on the other hand, we do have global illumination, so it's much more realistic And the first frame took 15 seconds, whereas on here the first frame only took 11 seconds. But what's interesting is once Octane takes a little bit longer to render in that first frame, to bring it into the VRAM in the card, after that, then the speed takes over. Then we instantly jump in, instead of 9 seconds for the average frame and clocking up at 11 at the top here in the beginning, instead we're hitting 7 and 6 is our max, and hitting up 9 only where our other card was hitting like 11. And when we get down to the bottom here, this last spot, we are hitting 26 frames on our last, 26 seconds on our last frame, frame 30 right here, this close-up of the tree. Whereas on Octane, we took 15 seconds. And you can see the light in Octane. I want to point out, this is the actual light that you can see. I could have turned that off, but I didn't think it would really affect the render time much. And you can see here in Cinema, we don't have that actually visible. But you can see here, we're going from this to this. You're getting much more detail in here. The shadows aren't going black. You're getting global illumination. You're getting subsurface scattering the Cinema doesn't have to deal with coming right in through here. So right off the bat, sorry about this, you're getting a ton more detail going through. Like it is really impressive. Not to mention, it was faster, so it was able to do more in less time. And as far as clarity, I kept Octane to render out at 126 samples. So I tried to make it as simple or as close as possible in grittiness and graininess. And I think we can kind of look in the shadows. We're getting a bit of grain in there, and we're getting grain in here too. So the grain, I felt, was very similar. We can see we're getting grain in Cinema here, not perfect. And in Octane, we're getting some grain in there too. So we could have bumped them both up, but I wanted to keep it relatively small. Now, finally, last but not least, is Arnold. I'm not as familiar with Arnold, and I'm not as good with adjusting the settings, so I just left it at the default. And to be fair, I never let Arnold run the full way. It literally, I let it go 8 frames, or not even 8, I stopped it at 8. I let it go 7 frames and stopped it because it was at 6 minutes and 27 seconds, a minute over Cinema 4D's longest time. And that's not too surprising because Arnold is a CPU renderer, just like Cinema 4D, and Arnold right now is trying to do subsurface scattering, global illumination, and everything else that Octane also does, but off of my CPU instead of my GPU, so it just cannot be as fast. It's going to be, at very best, the same speed most likely at what Cinema is going to render out at with those settings turned on. Global illumination, subsurface scattering, and the works right there. So here's basically the comparison. I'm seeing Octane is definitely winning right here and looks gorgeous. So that's a definite thing to note if you're thinking about trying to find a good renderer. And I felt like this comparison was pretty fair. If you felt like, though, that I could have done something different or better, please leave a comment below, and I'll try and do some tests differently or do them again to try and compare this better. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I think that should be it. Yep. Oh, I mean, another thing I want to touch on now, the video is basically over, but if you would like to get better performance out of Arnold, which is possible, here comes basically your choice. If you're ready to start boosting up your render capabilities, you have basically 2 options as far as render engine is concerned. You either go a GPU render or a CPU renderer. Now for me right now, since I have a 4790K, if I wanted to improve my rendering with Arnold, I would need to increase my CPU capability. So I'd have to upgrade my motherboard, because my motherboard is incapable of holding a CPU with more cores, because I need a higher end CPU with more cores, something probably around an 8 core, which would basically double my speed. So instead of 5 minutes to do that render, it would only taken like half that time. It would take in, because each frame in Cinema here, as you can see, took, where's our picture viewer? Ah, here it is. In Arnold, you'll see that our frames are taking 42 seconds for that first one. So we could have cut that in half to 20 seconds. But again, Octane did it in 15, which is pretty impressive. So I'd have to buy a very expensive CPU, very expensive setup. I'm looking at about possibly, well, I'd have to go up to like a 12-core CPU. Then in that point, you're in thousands of dollars. And then I'd have to buy a very expensive motherboard as well. Or you could mesh 2 computers together and have some type of render farm going, which is another possibility. But in the end, it's a lot of money. If you take the Octane route, you just need to buy the graphic card, assuming your motherboard already can handle that. But if you don't, it's only about $350 max for a motherboard that can handle good cards like that. So with what my setup is now, I'm leaning more towards Octane because all I have to purchase right now with my 970 is I'm thinking of going to a 1080, which is light years ahead of my 970, much, much higher. To be exact, my 970 has 1,600 CUDA cores, roughly, and the 1080 has 2,500 CUDA cores. So roughly double that speed. So we could cut this 15-second render in half to about 7.5 seconds, roughly. So it's a lot cheaper for me to go the Octane route and have this upgraded. And can I say another thing too, which is also impressive, is that Octane uses any card that you have in your computer as long as they're the same brand, from what I gather. So you can't put a NVIDIA with a a Radeon at all, because first off, another big thing to note is Octane does not accept Radeon graphic cards. It will not work. You must use a NVIDIA graphics card for this to work. But as long as you have NVIDIA graphic cards, it's fine. And what's great is if I had another 970, they're completely compatible together. Heck, even if I didn't have a 970, I could put a 1080 with my 970, and they both would work at peak performance 100% max. This is not considered SLI. So don't get what Octane's doing here considered SLI, because SLI does not work both cards together the same way. SLI is just bridging one card to the other and having that card kind of help out. This is both cards working on the same application at the exact same time. SLI is not required at all. Meaning if you have one 970 and it took 15 seconds, if you put another 970 in, it'll cut that time in half. So it would be 7.5, almost guaranteed. So this means if I buy a 1080 and get my seconds cut down to 7.5, because it's like double the power in that card, I could buy another 1080 or a different card and shave off even more time and more time. And I could just keep stacking cards as much as my motherboard can support, which my particular one can hold 4 graphic cards. So there's a lot of potential rendering power behind this, which would save me a lot of money in the end. But I've rambled on long enough. Thank you guys for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. Leave a comment in the comment section below if you have any questions whatsoever, and I will see you guys in my next tutorial.